Welcome to the Pandemic Files podcast, hosted by Dr. David Adnero. With each episode, we will be exploring the unprecedented public health response and those involved in it. More information can be found at thepandemicfiles.com. You can also subscribe on your favorite platforms, including Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. I would like to welcome to the podcast three nurses who served vital roles at our COVID-19 field hospital in the early days of the pandemic. Kurt Barton was assigned to the field hospital as a member of the New Jersey Air National Guard. Christopher Canara was an experienced healthcare leader who put aside his training to become a nurse practitioner to volunteer his talents. And Claire Giordano continued her employment as a frontline nurse in emergency departments while also volunteering at the field hospital. Thank you, all three of you, for doing this. I'm really excited. So the first question I've been asking people is, what were you doing in March of 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic? Ladies first. So Claire, do you want to start?
I was an ER nurse, and I was in my last semester of my doctorate program. I actually graduated while I was working at the East Orange campus.
I remember that. I remember there was a party for you.
Yep.
Very nice. And Kurt, where were you?
I was in a procedure world at Chester County Hospital, and we were basically trying to figure out, are we going to close down? What are we going to do? And then I got a call from the commander saying, the National Guard saying, hey, there's going to be an opportunity. You may need to be prepared. You may need to get activated for the state. It's like, okay. So,
and at that time, you were a captain, right, in the Air National Guard, or the Air Guard,
correct,
for New Jersey. And you had been in the National Guard for how long? And when 2020 came along?
2020. Well, this year is my 27th year, so that would make it 23 years.
Got it. Okay. And Chris, what were you doing at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020?
Yeah, it was interesting because I remember well. I had just resigned from my position. I was a hospital administrator with the intent to go to NP school. And as I'm going to NP school, I'm vacationing in Grenada, and they're telling me, I'm getting ready to go to NP school, I'm vacationing in Grenada, and they're telling me that I have to come back to the States, otherwise I may not be able to come back. So other than that, I came back to the States, and I was kind of delayed a little bit with my admission to NP school, and I was just waiting for an opportunity to help with what was going on. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I wanted to do something, and where I was.
All right. And so, the pandemic comes along, I think we all will remember where we were roughly around March, when I think early March, when this became real, when the first fatality on March 4th was announced. And Kurt, you've already covered how you ended up coming to the field hospital, but for Claire and Chris, how did you hear about the field hospital? How did you come to volunteer there? And what did you think you were volunteering for when it first became an opportunity?
Claire, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I remember seeing on the news just how bad it was in New York. And I was getting emails like, come help here. And I knew I wanted to come help somewhere else because New Jersey, we kind of had it, but not as bad as New York. So I had these emails like opportunity with a staffing agency to work up at the COVID hospital. So I just sent in my resume and I said, well, if they take me, they take me. And so then they took me, and I actually I'm a little bit of a crazy person, but I had a full-time job in one ER. I had a per diem job in another ER, which I worked full-time hours. So basically 2 full-time jobs. And I was in NP school. And I was like, sure, why not? I just need to help somebody else somehow. So I had no idea what I was getting into, no idea what it was, but I was just like, you know what? I'm here, I'm available, I can do it.
So, as I said, Dave, I was between jobs, and I was getting ready to go to NP school, and I was watching everything that was going on in the news, and I really wanted to help. And, call it fate, but I got a call. I don't know how they got my number or my information, but I got a call from the recruiter or the agency that the field hospital was using to recruit people, and they asked me if I was interested in a management position in the field hospital. So obviously that's what I was ready, and that's how I ended up at the field hospital.
Got it. And how were they describing this to you? Because, when I got the phone call, couple days before I started, it was described as we were going to be decanting hospitals of non-COVID patients, because there were still some of those in hospitals at the end of March, beginning of April, that it was going to be in a convention center, which I was like, okay, very interesting. But how were they describing it to you?
Right. They gave you a little bit more detail than they gave me. Basically, what I was told was they were setting up a makeshift hospital that was set up by the National Guard and the state police, and there would be patients with COVID. It would be a COVID-19 hospital where patients would be coming, as you said, to make room for the new patients that were coming in the hospital. So they were going to decant the patients over here, and that's all I got. When I got there, it was a little, I don't think I really understood what it was going to be like, because you have to understand something. I come, and you understand this based on your past experience. I was an administrator for many years, and I'm used to coming into a hospital where you have order, semblance, a lot of policies and protocols, processes, and, that wasn't there when we got there. Right? Exactly.
I think my email was that it was going to be originally at the Meadowlands, and I was like, "Oh, it's going to be in the football field." And then I was trying to imagine in my head, how are they going to put like cots on a football field, and how are they going to cover it? But whatever, I'm down. And then I think I may have been assuming wrong, but my assumption was that it was just COVID patients from the hospital that didn't need to stay there anymore, that they needed to make room, and they just needed somewhere else, that someone else would be there for them.
And so, Claire, what was your first thought when you walked in, I guess during orientation, and got a tour of what this was?
My first thought was, well, this isn't a football field. And then it kind of like blew me away in a way that they could turn a convention center into what it was turned into, like how they got all the cots in there and all of the different patient areas and how it all just like fit. But it was also kind of like you walk in and it's just the lobby, and then it's behind those doors you're walking into COVID land, and it was just kind of like, okay, this is real, this is it, we're doing it.
Now, Kurt, you had some experience, obviously, setting up, essentially field hospital type things in your time with the military. How did this differ from when you first walked in, from what you'd experienced both in the United States and overseas?
So, very different. So first off, I wasn't told anything that y'all were told. I was like, hey, by the way, you're just reporting to Meadowlands. And I'm like, great, the football field? Exactly like Claire said. I'm like, okay, so then we just kept going and bypassing and everything. And we ended up at the convention center. I was like, oh, this is where we're at. But it's very different. So in the military, we have EMEDS package, and basically what it is we can deploy a hospital that's already pre-made. It's tents. They're Alaskan tents, and we set them up, and then we go in there, and there's plans. There's always you have inventory of everything. What's supposed to be in your OR? What's supposed to be in your med surge? Everything's already planned out. When we came to this, there was nothing. But with that, we kind of had a good idea and understanding of what we needed and how to operate. So it really helped us. It wasn't anything unusual. We're used to being flexible, because sometimes you go somewhere and you don't have what you need. So during Katrina, I think 2009 or whatever, I was down in New Orleans, and it was kind of in the same setup, and you get there and you're like, oh, well, we need this, and this, and how do we manage this? And it's just being flexible. So fortunately, I've had this experience a couple of times, and it just helped.
When you were down for Katrina, was there also a large contingent of non-military personnel that you were working with, or was it an all-military? Because I think that must have been a little bit different coming in. Did you know that you were going to be working with a largely civilian staff, or again, that wasn't really described when it first started?
Again, no one knew anything, so we didn't know. We found out Friday night what we were doing. We met with Colonel Frank and, I can't remember her name, sorry, Captain Haley. And they kind of let us know what was happening and what the plan was, because they had been there for a couple of weeks. setting up the convention center. And that's all we knew. That was that Friday night before we opened up on Monday. Yeah, so going in there, realizing that we're working with civilians was a little different, because when I was in, this is the first time I've ever interacted with, number one, the Army and civilian. Normally it's an Air Force operation or an Army operation. It's not usually mixed. And this is the first time it was a joint service in addition to civilian that I've been a part of.
Chris, when you found out that you were going to be working with National Guard personnel, have you ever worked with military personnel, or was this something you ever pictured you'd be doing?
The answer, no. I never thought I'd be working with military personnel, but I tell you, I've worked very closely with Kurt, and it was a great experience working with the military. I was honored to work with these brave men and women. I think we collaborated very, very well.
Yeah, I second that.
And Claire, what was your first reaction when you realized that there was going to be, besides people you didn't know, but this somewhat cohesive team of military personnel?
I don't think I realized that it was, from the information I got, I don't think I realized it was in conjunction with military personnel until I actually got there and saw everybody. Right. And I was like, oh, okay, we're working as one big group. And then there was a little bit of bumps, I think, in the beginning where where they weren't sure who was scheduling us, whether it was military or the staffing agency. So there was one day that I had got there and I was driving an hour and a half, just one way just to get there. And I drove all the way up there, and I was the overnight. And I got there and they're like, oh, no, we don't have you scheduled. So one agency had me scheduled, and then one agency didn't, and that happened to about 6 of us that night, and we were all just like,
I remember that.
Waiting to figure out who was going home and who was staying.
Yeah, I remember that too.
I think that was one of the many fires that you all put out with Patty, I believe.
Yeah, it got resolved quickly.
And so, starting out, you walk into the setting. Chris, you mentioned we're all healthcare providers. We're all used to having, wall gas, rules, regulations, IDs, Joint Commission or DNV or somebody who will come in and inspect us. We come into places that have traditions and cultures that we learn about as we're working. We do orientations, and you all basically walk in on day one or something close to it, and are part of the people who are now going to be setting up how we're going to do nursing care in this facility. Just talk about what that was like.
Back to what we were talking about with collaboration. I'm sure the military has their way of doing things, and as Dave said, civilians that work in the hospital, we have our way of doing things. But the great thing was we were able to collaborate, and as it was taking on a life of its own, what I feel is that when people were actually stepping up to the plate. So if you remember, like for instance, Freudling, who was respiratory therapist, he took a lead role basically on his own, because he would come to us with these great ideas. And, obviously at that point we were listening to anything and everything, because we were setting up a hospital basically from scratch, right? So, and based on his experience, he would come and talk to us about this would be a better way to build the mousetrap. And as a result, that would become the protocol. And then you had Maria, who was another great person, who was a charge nurse. She also the lead role, because as far as orientation is concerned, we had a lot of new nurses, which is somewhat challenging when you go to orient them. And she stepped up to the plate, and we were able to, everybody knew if they had any questions, regarding patient safety or care, we'd go to Maria. But if you want to talk about the hospital itself, I can remember. Kurt, do you remember this? I remember walking in my first day or second day, setting up the hospital, and Patty Dravik, who was great, she took us to the back and she tells us, this is your first assignment. Do you remember what that first assignment was? They gave us lists of the equipment and things that had been delivered to the hospital, but there were no rhyme and reason to any of it. And we had to organize it and find out what was there and set up things and protocols to make it work and more efficient. You were a big part of that, Kurt.
Kurt froze.
There were many challenges, but we were able to we did good work.
Yep.
Did good work.
Sorry, I cut out there for a moment.
That's okay. So.
Yeah, Chris had been talking about the first assignment you and he got from Patty, which was basically, here's a list of all the equipment we're supposed to have, figure out where it is and figure out where it goes.
That was the first, that's when we first started working very closely together. And that's when I learned that the military are very good problem solvers.
Yes, that was, yeah, no, 100%. What I was going to say is that I do remember that. One of the things I wanted to piggyback off of you, Chris, was that the biggest thing was that a lot of people stepped up, just like you said. I think as far as like even discharge rounds and different things like meeting twice a day or whatever, I think it was a social worker who was like, hey, we need to do this. We need, I don't remember exactly who it was, but exactly people started saying, this is the process that we need that needs to happen. We need to do this. And we just like, okay, let's do it. And then one person, it was like, we brought it up to one doc and the doc's like, yeah, we need to do this. And then the respiratory therapist was like, yeah, we do. And we all just collaborated. It was like, let's do it. And that's what we did. So, and then if we didn't like it, then we just adjusted it. It was just, it was really cool.
Yeah. So Dave, to your point, it did take a life on its own because the people were so great. Everybody participated and they really wanted to make sure that the patients got the care that they needed and everybody was safe, especially such a, desperate and unsure time in our history.
Yeah. And I just remember how, kind of like how things would kind of just come around. I remember whatever day it was, somebody said to me, I had brought something up, like, well, that's something we should address during, the afternoon patient rounds. And I'm like, my first thought was, what patient rounds? But the person said it to me like, well, of course, about the patient rounds. And then lo and behold, there's this around the table conversation happening about the patients and what they need. And, that moment when you just realize that something that you've been working on has taken a life of its own was fantastic. I'm always the person where there's how I think it's going to go and there's how it turns out. And I'm happy if how it turns out is better than what I thought it was how I envisioned it. And this was definitely one of those examples. Now, Claire, I guess I'll ask you this question. So, you walk in, do you want to describe what the physical structure looked like from a patient care perspective? Like what a unit kind of looked like to give people an idea?
So you walk in and you have to scan your badge in order to get in. Kind of like going to work, you clock in, but you didn't clock in. You had to be like approved to be there. And then on the outside were like the lobby. There were lockers where you could put all your belongings in, and then there were the lunch tables, and then there were the 4 doors as the entrance to the the inside of the convention center. And you walk in, and then there's all you got your PPE. You got some of your PPE before you walked in, and then you walked in, and then you got your gown because you saved your gown, and then you just kind of like you kind of remembered where you put your stuff from the day before. Sometimes it was there, sometimes you threw it out and you needed to get new one. I don't know, but you put on your PPE, and then it was just rows and rows and rows of cots that were separated by it was like a curtain, and then it just went all the way down. There were different pods. It was like pod A, pod B, pod C, alphabetized, and then in the back was the pharmacy, and then where all the oxygen was, and then there were little nursing stations, which was a folding table. I think that's about what I remember.
And I believe we had, correct me if I'm wrong, there were phones, I think, at the nursing stations. Might have been.
There were, I think you had to carry, did you have to carry a phone? I think you had a little portable phone that you carried.
Well, we had walkie-talkies, but I don't know how many of those we had.
It was a walkie.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it as you're describing, it had a very otherworldly feel to it. Chris, what was when you first started doing that? You'd worked in hospitals a long time, obviously. Was this anything you'd ever done before?
No, not at all. In fact, to your point, the environment was very austere. It was just 4 walls. There were no TV. There's no bathroom. There's no sink. There's no running water. There's no phone at the bedside, and there's no call bells. Right. So That's a very good point in terms of that was another process that you and Patty developed, that we started using these portable bells so that the patients could actually contact us when they needed help, in addition to the rounds for patient safety. But yeah, it was challenging, and you have to give it to the nurses because their dedication in terms of taking care of their patients, it's much harder when you don't have pneumatic tubes like you do in the hospital to get pharmacy drugs, when you don't have call bells, and you have to be more alert and aware about what's going on with your patients. And then, not to mention all the other things in terms of toiling your patients and such. It was a tough time, and those nurses, I give it up to them because they were dedicated and they did a great job.
And so, we did a couple days of what essentially was orientation and setup. And then by, I believe, Tuesday or Wednesday of that week, we started taking patients. What are your memories of the first patient? Like, describe what the patients were like in terms of, what their medical conditions were, what their needs were, and the beginning of care in essentially a very austere and also brand new setting.
Where are you going to go? Or
Sure. So I only ever work overnight. We did get a few new patients on the overnight shifts, actually. But no, I didn't go to orientation. I remember just going, my first day was, okay, here you are, jump right in. Which it kind of is a theme for my life, but you know what? I roll with it. So the patients, I remember they had a lot of comorbidities. Like they weren't just simple, oh, hey, I'm a 27-year-old person, I have COVID, and I'm here. They were all comorbid. They had a lot of conditions going on. I remember a big thing was they all had oxygen, and the tubes were connected to the giant oxygen tanks, and we went around with a little portable pulse ox and just checked all their oxygen levels quite frequently. But a lot of them, a lot of comorbidity.
Right. I remember the same thing. These were not simple patients because obviously the patient with comorbidities were more prone to COVID-19. So, yeah, and the thing I remember the most is the look on their face when they came in. They were really, really scared, many of them. They were, it was a very uncertain time for them. So, yeah, they were not simple patients, and many of them were on many different types of medications.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, that people who had COVID back then were kind of treated like how unfortunately people would treat lepers in a lot of ways. Like there was a little bit of their families didn't necessarily want to be close to them. They didn't have a lot of the contact they had with us was through multiple layers of protective equipment that you're always having to shout. I remember my voice always being hoarse by the end of a shift. Just normal conversations were hard, without a doubt. And what I remember is that our patients didn't need a lot of things, but the things they needed badly. Like they did need a lot of oxygen, but the 2 or 3 liters they needed, they couldn't live without.
Right.
And I remember that so much of what these patients really needed was just good basic nursing care to get them better. I don't think because we couldn't do a lot of fancy things.
No.
And, we gave some medications and everything else, but most of it was just good basic nursing care. And a lot of just, a lot of TLC and a lot of just support as they were regaining their strength. And, I agree. They looked very scared when they would come in, but that after you knew they were ready to leave when you heard somebody smiling or laughing.
Yes.
You knew they were getting close to being ready to leave.
Absolutely.
Or when they started complaining about the food or the bed. If you were strong enough to complain about the bed, pretty much we knew you were ready to go. And that only for some people that took a couple of weeks, and for some people that took only a couple of days. Without a doubt. We had access to things. So besides taking the patients coming in, we also had the hotel next to us that was providing services. And really, it was almost like transition services. People who had been exposed to COVID or had COVID who couldn't go home for various reasons, but didn't need a hospital-based setting. And that really gave us a nice outlet for transition from us. Chris, did you deal with them a lot at that transition period?
Yeah, actually, I did on a few occasions. Yes, I did. They were great. They were very helpful, and so I was in communication with them in terms of trying to help set the transport up from the hospital to the hotel. And they were. I remember they were very, very good, and we never had any delays. They were willing to help us to move the patients along, understanding that we need to make room for more patients and that more patients will be coming in to clear up the hospital. So it was great. they were great.
And Claire, you remarked that you worked only nights. So what
Mhm.
were, the one interesting thing is night kind of got announced when the overhead lights got turned out, because these rooms had individual lamps, but essentially these are stadium lights
Yep.
that are on. And at some point somebody went, we need to have people sleep, which means we need to turn the
Lights go
lights
out.
out, which also means it got dark.
There was a lamp at like the nurse's station folding desk, and then I think did I have a little flashlight or something to walk around with? There was enough illumination from the little lights around at little different nursing stations, but some patients had their little lamps on in their rooms at night, so it wasn't pitch black. You could get around, but I think I had a little flashlight as well to kind of help in the darker areas.
And Dave, engineering came in. They were also great, the electricians and stuff. They helped put up those little lamps, if you remember those, in certain areas on the sides of the tents so that people could walk through and see and not get hurt for safety reasons.
Right, they kind of backlit. Yeah, I remember they backlit the sides so people could actually walk and not trip over
Yep.
a lot of. That was the other thing. I mean, in an average hospital, there's nothing on the floor of a hospital, right? There's no cords running. That's not stuff we would ever allow. But there was a lot of things that were oxygen, at times electricity, that were regularly running on the floor, usually taped down, etc. But it was a tripping hazard at all times if you weren't paying attention.
Yeah.
But they did their best to kind of like make it safe for the staff.
And one of the things that I haven't talked about with others yet is we ended up having to transfer about 10% of the patients back to an acute care facility because they were too sick for us to handle. They either needed something we didn't have, a CAT scan. One patient we thought may have had appendicitis. And some were just respiratorily too sick for us to handle. Talk about taking care of some of those patients. Kurt, if you want to start off and then comment on that.
Actually, I don't think I was there. I remember there was one patient we had that was the mental health patient that took out almost a lot of people. And we tried to, and we had to figure out a place to send them back to somewhere to a mental health facility. And then I remember the gentleman you were talking about with the appendicitis, but it was just, I don't know exactly what the process that we took to do it. I don't remember, but I remember trying to. It was a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, just responding to emergencies in a field hospital also, I guess, is what that's like versus codes in a hospital.
Well, I think what we've done is we had a lot of good, in the military side, we had a lot of good physicians that were used to intubating and whatnot. And so one of the things we did do was we used to hold a drill. We, especially, if we had to vent someone or intubate anybody, we had a specific place. I remember us doing a drill twice just to kind of get everybody aware and what to do and how to go. I think, Chris, you were part of that as well.
Yeah, Dave actually started that protocol, so I remember. Yeah, so
appreciated is that safety was incredibly important for everybody there. We also, quite frankly, had access to excellent personal protective equipment that a lot of hospitals didn't have. Claire, you were working in other hospitals. Think about what you had available for PPE at the field hospital versus what you probably had in your other facilities.
Oh, it was definitely better at the field hospital for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we were lucky to have. I just remember when a pallet of shrink-wrapped N95 cartons showed up. It was maybe the sexiest thing I'd ever seen in my life. It was like 14,000 N95 masks. And I was like, okay, we're going to be able, because I was very worried that somebody was going to die from the staff. And I just, when I saw what we were going to have available, I felt badly that we would have it and that the people in a lot of the other hospitals didn't, but I was very happy with what we had, without a doubt.
Not to cut you off, but what was really cool is that watching, being part of inventory, because you may remember this, but we had face shields from Ford, from Apple, from a bunch of other companies, and I was like, wow, how do we get this?
Right.
But it was really cool. Just
I remember thinking that that our hand sanitizer very much smelled like vodka.
It did.
Because it did.
It did.
I know. I think a distillery donated a bunch to us.
Right.
They did. I mean, they really. I mean, they're companies that converted their normal processes to other things.
Right.
Yeah.
And I
They had the one
was,
that smelled like rum or something. I was like, what is this?
yeah, that was very, very different experience. And then Claire, at night, what was it like when there'd be a sick patient at night? I mean, I know we had a paramedic available
Mhm.
and an EMT, which kind of gave me the ability to go home at night. And you were trained in, you had done emergency nursing, but
Yeah.
most of your fellow nurses were not. They were not. They were outpatient nurses to a large extent. They weren't even
Yeah.
hospital-based nurses because hospital-based nurses were needed in the hospital. So, what was it like at nighttime?
I don't think I had emergency while I was ever on shift. I know I heard about them and I knew the EMTs were there and we actually chatted a few times, but we didn't actually have one. But I just remember the other nurses that were there, even just with routine, not, I don't want to say routine nursing care, but some of the other like questions or concerns or comments that would come up. I glad I was there to help, be a resource for whatever they needed.
And Chris, you made it very clear that you wanted to spend as little time as possible in the command center, and you were more than happy to spend as much time as we wanted basically at bedside or in the hot zone,
Yeah.
working with the providers in the hot zone.
Yes, I did, and I did. I was great working. I worked, as I said, very close with Kurt, and
Yeah.
that's where I felt my place was because there were so many challenges, as you know, the type of patients that we had, the new nurses who needed the support, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to be out there because obviously it's a very difficult time for the patients, but it was a very difficult time for the staff, especially the new staff experiencing this for the first time. So yeah, I felt as far as my experience both as a nurse and as in leadership would be more helpful on the floor because obviously you and Patty had everything else covered, so you didn't need me there.
And Kurt, I remember, and I talked about this in a couple of the other sessions. This was a little bit different for the military folks. This was a deployment for you all.
Hmm.
While myself and Chris and Claire would go home at the end of the day, or Claire would go back to the other 3 jobs she had.
Yep.
You all, this was a deployment
Yep.
at a hotel under orders. What was that like? I mean, you were separated from your family for a long period of time. You didn't see them for, I think, a couple of months, if
Yeah.
I remember correctly.
Yeah, no, it was, I think working, I mean, you kind of go into mindset in the military. Like when you deploy and you go different places, you're like, okay, this is what I got to do. And you talk to your family here and there. I knew I wouldn't see my family for a little bit. And I think it was like 4 or 5 weeks before I even like talked, we met at a park is what happened just to kind of, because we didn't really know with COVID and what was going on and still trying to figure it all out. It's one of those things where my family was like, oh, well, we're home. Why aren't you here? And I'm like, okay, that's all right. But you FaceTime as much as you can. But for me, it was like, and if you remember, I mean, like the first 3 weeks, we were working 16-hour days. And for me, it was just like, okay, well, I'm just going to go back to bed, and wake up in the morning. So I didn't have to worry about them because I knew my wife took care of them. So that kind of like took a burden off of me. But then I felt bad because then I was putting a burden on her. It was why we had to, once I was able to see him, it was great. But it was just, yeah, it's tough. It's always tough.
And I would
Yeah.
imagine employ two things. One, you're physically near them, right? I mean, if you're
Mhm.
in
Right.
another part of the world, you can't it's not a 2 hour drive to see them. And the other
Right.
one, I think, for the first time is while simultaneously you were doing something that put you a little bit at risk, all of our families were at risk from COVID. I mean, there was no safe spot in our country, particularly in New
Right.
Jersey during the very beginning. Claire and Chris, how'd you guys handle that? Were you, in terms of, the people you were living with or your family that you would normally see
Claire, I'll let you go
during the
first.
pandemic?
I was actually living by myself at the time, so I just kept going on with my daily thing. And honestly, I didn't have much else of a life. I went job to job to job, school, back to job. my parents live a couple states away, so I didn't see them that often anyway. It kind of worked out okay for me, but I might be the exception.
So
Claire, what was it like going from the emergency department setting where you were, where people were very sick, people were dying every shift, multiple people probably, and then coming to the field hospital where you were seeing the patients who were surviving?
It was different because in the ER you saw everybody that was really, really sick, and you weren't sure what was going to happen in the beginning. You didn't even know how to take care of them. You were just like, I don't know. We're just going to do this, and we got to do the best we can. And then in the field hospital, you kind of saw, like, not the end result of it, but down the line. I was just talking to my dad the other day that in the ER, you see them at their sickest, and then you send them off to the ICU. And that's the end of your knowledge of that person. But then you see them at the field hospital, and you're like, okay, well, this is them coming out the other side, and some of them are doing okay. And just kind of managing their care from that point on. That it was kind of a realization, like, okay, these people, some of them are making it out this far, and they are getting better.
And Chris, me about balancing life at home or
Right.
life with family and friends, with being at the field hospital so much, being around patients who had COVID. How was that handling those transitions for you?
Well, obviously my biggest fear was I didn't want to infect anybody in the home front. So, we set up our own protocol because my significant is also in the medical field. So we had our own station in the garage where we would take precautionary measures to disrobe and everything prior to going in the home. But it was basically, obviously, a little stressful on both of us because she's a physician and I'm a nurse. We like to come home, and that was kind of like our refuge. We tried not to talk too much about the day-to-day. That was our safe space. So because we both saw things, obviously, that were not always good. So we tried to come home and be positive and get ready for the next day and take care of patients and make sure that, we did our best.
And switching gears a little bit, I think we've all talked about the fact that the people involved in this had to create both the standard operating methodology from scratch and modify it on a regular basis, but also, quite frankly, create a culture. And most people tend to think of culture as something that takes years to develop, and yet that place very distinctively had a culture. Within a few days to a week, I think it was fairly well baked in. As new people came in, they were introduced to, I thought, a very mature culture. Just if you want to talk about what you encountered in that culture that felt different, for better or worse, than what you had experienced in other healthcare settings.
I feel like the camaraderie was just, everyone was there to help each other. It didn't matter whether you were a nurse or a PA or a physician, or even if you were like the military personnel, you were all there and you all had each other's back. Kind of very similar to a well-functioning ER.
I agree. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree too. I think the biggest thing is that we all felt like we were part of something bigger than ourselves. We knew what we were doing. We had an ultimate goal was to protect patients, or, to care for patients as best as we could. And I think you had everyone step up. Like, you had everyone engaged. Everyone bought into what we were doing. I think that was huge. And that's where I think that culture, now where did that culture come from? People like Chris, because you saw Chris out there on the field all the time. You saw me out there. You saw everyone, like Frolin and like just everyone, like even yourself, Dr. Dave. Like it's just, you saw Patty, everyone was out there doing, no job was too small for anyone.
That's right.
And that's what I think the biggest piece is that people bought in because they saw from leadership that, like, look at this colonel, he's sitting there doing this, and look at this major, he's doing this, and all these other people. And then I think that's the biggest thing. I think that's where that came from. And it was quick too. It wasn't like, I think people started doing that right away. And that's when people bought in.
I think the culture kind of evolved on its own in the sense that, the circumstances that we were facing, and that people tend to, when tragedy hits, they take a step back and they realize, what's really important. So I think everybody had the same goal in mind, was to take care of the patients. And that everybody, like, I guess I'm a military, Kurt, but I don't know the saying, but everybody goes home, So leave nobody behind. Everybody goes home.
Yeah.
And as far as, Claire, with the camaraderie, you would see a lot of physicians, even like, because we had surgeons, We had, plastic surgeons. We had all the doctors that would normally be in like a lot of the outpatient areas that were closed during COVID. They came to our hospital, and how many of them had done primary care in so many years. So, Dave, you can relate to this in terms of we had these doctors that were taking them out of their environment and were throwing them into the COVID hospital, and they're doing well. And I think the reason that was because of the camaraderie that they had with the other doctors and the PAs and the nurse practitioners. Everybody just kind of band together and worked as a team.
I found, the fancy word in medicine is that we have a lot of authority gradients, right? So anytime you're doing patient safety, et cetera, a lot of this is how do you flatten the authority gradient so that a tech will point something out to a physician or a nurse. We live in a hierarchical world in medicine, and the field hospital was flat because, first of all, nobody knew each other. Second of all, it was hard to identify other than what was written on your gown. Mine said David Doctor. That was pretty much it. And I think that really contributed to that sense of we're all in it together part. And I think it contributed to everybody was working together. I know that there were doctors who did things that they would consider nursing care while they were at the field hospital, and that they never would have done or had an opportunity to do otherwise. And, I also know that nurses felt very comfortable in suggesting things and bringing things up. And I think, Claire, that goes to your statement, and I'll be a little bit biased. That is very much like a well-functioning, high-functioning emergency department, where the team as a whole is greater than the parts. I was very intimidated when I came into the healthcare area because it changed so much in this short. Like, if I hadn't been there, like if I was last there Monday and today's Wednesday, I had to relearn a whole bunch of stuff, and I had to put my ego aside and just ask people, "Hey, what are you doing now?" And also not make it sound like that I was critiquing that things had changed, because I just want to know what people were doing. So it was like this, I don't want to sound obnoxious because I just want to know. And I also just have to be comfortable with, I'm the least knowledgeable person of what's going on because I haven't been there in 2 days. So I was always a little bit intimidated coming into the area because it had taken on a life of its own. And I just thought it was fantastic.
Right. It was a work in progress, ever evolving, so yeah.
Yeah.
And so then obviously things begin to change a little bit after about, I think, 4 to 6 weeks in the convention center. We were given instructions to break down and move, so that we really needed to move by, I think it was like May 10th, so they could clean it thoroughly and hand it back on June 1. And we went into essentially an old rehabilitation hospital, so a space that had previously had patients, still didn't have things like oxygen in the walls and stuff like that. But it was like a real building with walls and doors, and that presented some opportunities, but it also presented some challenge. I don't know. And Kurt, you guys, the military, were beginning to transition out right about then.
Yeah, that was interesting.
And in some ways, I think it was harder to be in. I think what we got was the wraparound services became much better because they all came from East Orange General, which was fantastic. It was great having a neighbor that was actually a healthcare facility. But at the same time, I think coming into a more traditional setting kind of changed some things a little bit.
It was actually kind of eerie going into a hospital that was just us on one floor and nothing else anywhere. Like, you walked in and there were the two military personnel at the door just to make sure that you were supposed to be there. But then after that, there was the kitchen, or not the kitchen, but lunch area and everything was on that ground floor. Then you took the elevator up, and then as soon as those doors opened, it was the hot zone, or whatever you want to call it. But it was weird. It was just weird for me being in a hospital that wasn't functioning as a normal hospital. It almost made more sense to be at the convention center, but in my brain.
But we had to, it was like we had to reinvent ourselves all over again, because we had to consider the space that we had, consider infection control, have another section for gowning. So it was like starting from scratch again, taking what we had learned from the COVID hospital and bringing it there.
Yeah, to
And so,
redevelop all the policies and everything.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
And in a vertical structure, things like security, fire safety
Right.
felt much more omnipresent in there than it did in a convention center for me.
Agreed.
Like, how are we going to move patients out off of the second or third floor of a building if we need to evacuate the building?
Right.
As opposed to there's multiple doors to get out of a convention center. How are we going to keep the staff safe in a building that was basically felt a little bit haunted? How are we going to keep track of patients in this with that? And because there couldn't be locks on the doors or anything, so it felt very weird.
and also to Dave, I mean, we went from just one single floor to multiple floors. Now you have stairs to deal with, and now you have that was another challenge and issue to think of, that we were thinking about, and it was crazy.
And then there were still fun things like Claire. I do remember when they had a party for you when you were graduating.
Yeah, so I just don't like, I never like to talk about myself, so I didn't tell anybody because I was there the night before, and then the next night it was a 2 or 3 day in a row stint, and I didn't tell anybody until like last minute, and they're like, "Why didn't you tell us? We could have made this so much bigger." So it was a last minute thing, but I still have the pictures because it's the only graduation pictures I have because I didn't
Right.
walk.
Right.
They're actually like taped up on my wall, like professional walking pictures. But we made the manila envelopes. We cut them. We made a little graduation cap, and out of the tourniquets, we made tassels, and they made a fake little diploma. And we took pictures in front of this.
That's
I
great.
still have some of those pictures. That epitomized the family feeling of the place to be.
It was great. It was honestly, it's one of my greatest memories.
That's awesome.
That's great.
Yeah.
And now, kind of move into the last part of this. So, Kurt, you came off probably mid-May. I want to say most of the military left.
Had a group come off right before, like, it was like the end of April, and then we had another group. I think the rest of us came off. I think it was like the last week of May, and then because we had to quarantine for 2 weeks, so we sat in a hotel for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Or 10 days, something like that. I was like, this is great.
And so, what was it like going back to your civilian life?
For me, it was a challenge. I went from basically in leadership with this COVID hospital to back to a staff nurse, where people were looking at me like, where have you been? And they're like, well, get to work, And I'm like, all right, but listen, guys, here's processes. We need to improve on this. And they look at me like, yeah, but okay, who cares? All right. So it was just a challenge for me personally. And so I had to take kind of almost starting like a new job and just sit back and not do anything and observe for the next 30 to 60 days and kind of figure out what could be better, what can. And I'm always thinking about process improvement, and so or how to do things better and more efficient. And I had to like get back into workflow and then start. Then one of the things when I got back is I learned to have other people say what needed to be engineered. I helped other people see it, and then they brought it up and not me. So it was like it had more. It was a challenge.
Had you experienced that with other deployments? That feeling?
No, actually, I have not. I deployed in 2010, was gone for 5 months, and I came back, and it worked. But the difference is I was never in, like, I've always, my goal is to be a director, and I never had that taste of it like I did in COVID. And so when I deployed in 2010, I wasn't in leadership. I was charge nurse, and I was all that other stuff. But when I got back, I didn't have the same mentality, so it was a lot easier. This one was probably my most difficult.
And Chris, so the field hospital winds down June.
Okay.
What was next for you?
Well, after we made the move, I stayed. I actually left in June. I stayed to help open up with you and Patty, to help open up the hospital in East Orange. Right. And obviously that at that time things were dwindling down a little bit. I felt that it was a good time for me to move on and go back and try to finish up my NP. I miss, to Kurt's point, where he felt like, I think that the COVID hospital at the Meadowlands during that time was a very special place. And just like you said, Kurt, you went back to what we call reality, and it's different. I don't think I will ever experience what I experienced at the COVID hospital, Dave. I think that was a certain time in my life, and I'm sure Kurt and Claire will probably say the same thing, where just it was such a collaborative effort on everybody's part, where everybody just kind of like came together for the common good. And you don't often find what we had there. It was just such a special place. People would come up with suggestions. No idea was a bad idea. It was just everybody was there for the same purpose. So it wasn't quite the same at East Orange. It was a little different. I agree. You felt more like a hospital setting, and patients had walls and bathrooms and running water and call bells, which was great. But it still didn't have that feeling like what we did in the Meadowlands. It was such a unique time. Not everybody can say that they had that experience. And I'm very happy to say I was very proud to work with all of you and all the good people that we did. And Kurt, your leadership skills are beyond fantastic. If you ever need a recommendation for a director's position, you let me know.
Thank you.
Yours too, Dave.
Appreciate that. Claire, what was it like when you? I mean, because you went down to having you went from 3 jobs in school down to just 2 jobs.
Well, I stayed with Maria. I followed Maria, and we went up to North Jersey, and we did the testing, the mobile testing centers.
Right.
So I stayed with Maria. So I did that for a while. We went up. It was in Newark-ish area. We did testing. We went all to different areas. They actually did one down here in like Lakewood area, Ocean County. But I did that for quite some time, and then I got my job as an NP. And then she needed me when they were doing the mobile vaccinations. She needed an NP once, so I went and helped her there with that. So I kind of followed her around for a little bit.
Excellent. And Maria, she obviously played a huge role in the field hospital. Her role in the Department of Health continued. So when we get to that chapter of these things, I'm going to have her on. But yeah, I remember there were several times when I was at the Department of Health where I essentially picked up the phone and called either Patty or Maria, and whatever the problem was got solved. First, it was in 4th of July weekend when there was this family that was supposed to return to Nigeria. One of them came down with COVID, and the other 3 had been exposed. So they were essentially stuck in quarantine at Newark Airport, and we weren't staffing the place. And I called Maria at like 10 o'clock at night, and she had nurses and a provider by like 2 in the morning. Newark EMS picked them up in all their years worth of bags because I think the father had been training in Rhode Island or something for a year. So and the testing stuff, there was this whole conversation. We needed a mobile testing team. I'm like, I don't know who to call for this one. And there were more than a few times where alumni were integral in the efforts that followed. Absolutely. So as I've been doing this, I have these 4 questions I've been asking people. The first one, I think, Chris, you got to talk about, and I think Kurt also, but it's how do you feel about your time in the field hospital? Chris and Kurt, if you want to add anything else, you're more than welcome to. And Claire, I'd certainly like to hear your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, so I enjoyed it. I thought it was, again, we all worked so well together. You could go to anybody for help with anything, and if they didn't know the answer, they would find out, but anyone would answer any question or help you with anything you needed help with. It was just really a well-oiled machine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. It was probably one of the best experiences in my nursing career and in my military career. I mean, I got to just the collaboration we had amongst the Army and the Air Force, which was a great experience for us.